Both on this old house and the new Yankee workshop for years, we have always promoted safety in all aspects of what we do, but most importantly, in eye protection.
When you think about television history, you rarely think about a woodworking show. You think about drama, about competition, about personalities who dominate the screen and fight for your attention. But somewhere in the quiet corners of American television, there was a program that did something completely different. For 21 years, the new Yankee workshop existed on the margins of popular culture, never chasing ratings, never seeking controversy, yet somehow becoming one of the most influential and beloved programs in the history of American public broadcasting. And when it ended in 2009, the way it ended tells us something profound about authenticity, commitment, and what happens when someone gives everything to their craft. The story of why the new Yankee workshop ended is not a story of failure or decline. It's not a story about networks pulling the plug or audiences abandoning a show in favor of something flashier. Instead, it's a story about a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone, when it was time to walk away. That man was Norm Abram, a master woodworker who became, almost accidentally, one of the most important figures in American craft education. And the reason his show ended reveals something that the entertainment industry has largely forgotten. Sometimes the most powerful act an artist can make is knowing when to stop. To understand why the new Yankee workshop had to end, you first need to understand what made it different in the first place. When the show launched in 1989, American television was already obsessed with speed, spectacle, and excess. Reality television was exploding. Game shows were becoming more elaborate. Networks were experimenting with every gimmick they could imagine to keep viewers watching, to keep them entertained, to keep them engaged. Against this backdrop, producer Russell Morrish created something radical in its simplicity, a show where a craftsman simply built furniture. No hosts competing against each other. No dramatic reveals at the end of an episode. No elimination rounds or judges criticizing anyone's work. Just a man, his tools, his knowledge, and his unwavering commitment to doing things right. Morrish had worked with Norm Abram on this old house, where Norm served as the lead carpenter. Over the years, Morrish noticed something in Norm that went beyond technical skill. There was a patience in him. There was clarity. Norm had the rare ability to make complicated woodworking concepts feel accessible to people who had never picked up a chisel. He didn't simplify woodworking, he explained it honestly, which is something entirely different. So Morrish built him his own workshop, a 936 square foot space tucked behind a Massachusetts farmhouse, filled with every tool a serious woodworker could want. And in that workshop, something extraordinary began to happen. The format of the show was deceptively simple, but that simplicity was actually the result of careful thought. Norm would select a project, perhaps a shaker side table or a Windsor chair. He would visit a historical landmark or museum to study the original piece, understanding not just what it looked like, but why it was built the way it was. He would discuss the construction techniques with expertise that came from decades of practice. Then he would return to his workshop and build the piece himself, from start to finish, with nothing hidden from the camera. The audience saw every cut. They saw every joint. They saw what happened when something didn't fit perfectly the first time and needed adjustment. There were no stand-ins. There were no off-camera corrections or quietly swapped-in final versions. What viewers watched was real woodworking, done by a genuinely skilled craftsman, exactly as it happened. This authenticity became the soul of the show. People who understood woodworking could immediately recognize that what they were watching was real. The technique was genuine. The knowledge was authentic. But more importantly, people who knew nothing about woodworking could feel that authenticity too. There's a fundamental difference between watching someone demonstrate something they've learned to perform and watching someone who truly knows what they're doing. Norm had that quiet authority in every episode. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent his entire life understanding wood, understanding tools, understanding the mathematics and physics of joinery. And that confidence, communicated without arrogance or performance, became the foundation of why millions of viewers tuned in every week. During its run, The show became a Saturday morning institution. Woodworking club memberships increased. Tool sales spiked on weekends following new episodes. Educational institutions reported that enrollment in woodworking classes grew significantly. Norm hadn't simply hosted a television program. He had become, without seeking attention or recognition, one of the most influential figures in American craft. Over 21 seasons, he built approximately 235 different projects on screen. These weren't frivolous pieces designed to look good for 5 minutes and then be discarded. They were classic designs: shaker pieces, Windsor chairs, blanket chests, bookcases, period reproductions, the kinds of furniture that endure because they are built honestly, without unnecessary ornamentation, designed to last for generations rather than impress for a season. But this success came with a cost that was not immediately visible to viewers. Behind the scenes, what people didn't see was the enormous effort required to produce each episode. Between 40 and 60 hours of work went into creating a single 22-minute episode. That meant sourcing lumber, inspecting wood, locating pieces that met exact specifications. It meant designing a build process that would work within the constraints of television production while still maintaining the integrity and authenticity of the work. It meant setting up cameras, arranging lighting, positioning tools so that everything flowed naturally on screen. And at the center of all of this, Norm still had to do the actual woodworking. For more than 20 years, Norm stood on the bare concrete floor of that workshop for 8 to 12 hours a day during production seasons. The concrete was hard. The work was physically demanding. Repetitive sawing, chiseling, and sanding took their toll on his joints over time. His back, already stressed from decades of bending over workbenches and lifting heavy materials, accumulated strain. Plantar fasciitis developed from standing for extended periods on unpadded concrete. But Norm never showed any of this strain on camera. He didn't complain. He didn't let the audience see the cost of what was happening behind the scenes. The work looked just as careful, just as unhurried in the final seasons as it had in the earliest episodes. The physical demands of the show were compounded by the fact that Norm was essentially working 2 major television jobs simultaneously. While producing the new Yankee workshop during certain months of the year, he was also still working on this old house, which had its own demanding production schedule. For years, he balanced these 2 full-time commitments, though the nature of his roles was different. On this old house, he contributed his expertise as a master carpenter. Important work, certainly, but work that was shared with other team members. On the new Yankee workshop, he was everything. He was the designer, the builder, the teacher, and the host. Every single episode depended entirely on him showing up and doing the work from beginning to end. The weight of that responsibility was immense. As the years accumulated, the physical toll mounted quietly. Norm never discussed it publicly. He never mentioned his pain or his fatigue in interviews. He simply continued to do his work with the same precision and care he had always brought to it. But behind the scenes, conversations were beginning to take place. Quiet discussions between Norm, producer Russell Morrish, and WGBH Boston about what it would actually mean to continue producing the show. The question wasn't whether the show still worked. It clearly did. The ratings were stable. The audience remained loyal. The critical reception was universally positive. The question was whether it was reasonable to ask Norm to continue sacrificing his body in this way. By 2009, Norm was approaching 60 years old. He had been doing this work, this demanding, physical one-man show kind of work, for more than 2 decades. His body was sending signals that it couldn't continue at this pace forever. And Norm, in his characteristic way, listened to those signals. He didn't wait until he had suffered a major injury. He didn't push himself past the point where he could no longer perform at the level of excellence he demanded of himself. He made the decision that it was time to stop, and he made it on his own terms. What's important to understand is that this was entirely Norm's decision. In the years following the show's cancellation, various rumors circulated. Some people speculated that the network had pushed for the show to end. Others suggested there had been creative disagreements behind the scenes. Some claimed that declining viewership had forced the decision. All of these rumors were false. The people closest to the production were consistent and clear. There were no external forces pushing Norm out. The show had no enemies. It was not canceled. It was ended deliberately, thoughtfully, and entirely according to Norm's own choice about his life and his body. Norm's own statement about the decision was characteristically direct and modest. "We've had a great run," he said, without elaboration. "Built challenging projects, met wonderful woodworkers, and received loyal support from millions of viewers." That was the entire statement. No grievances. No dramatic explanations. Just gratitude and an acknowledgement that it was time. Russell Morrish added his own perspective, noting something that deserves emphasis. The show could not have continued with anyone else. The New Yankee Workshop was not a format that could be handed to a successor. It wasn't a structure that would survive with a different personality at the center. It was a specific man doing a specific thing in a specific way. When Norm decided it was time to stop, the show had to stop with him. Morrish also mentioned something that rarely gets discussed. Norm had his own projects that had been waiting. His timber-framed colonial home in Carlisle, Massachusetts, which he had built himself, had details he had always intended to finish, but never had the time or energy to address because the show consumed so much of his production calendar every year. Ending the New Yankee Workshop wasn't a retreat from woodworking. It was making space to finally do woodworking on his own terms, for himself and his family, without the pressure of deadlines or the weight of carrying an entire television production. When the announcement came on October 16, 2009, that WGBH Boston would not be producing further episodes of the New Yankee Workshop, the response from viewers was unexpected in its intensity. There was no farewell special. There was no dramatic finale episode designed to give the show a big send-off. It simply ended the way Norm had always worked, quietly, without unnecessary ceremony, and with everything already said. Yet within hours of the announcement, message boards and woodworking forums filled with responses. Fine Woodworking magazine reported that reader responses were unlike anything they had ever seen in response to a television news story. People wrote not brief comments, but lengthy messages describing how the show had been woven into their lives. Veteran woodworkers wrote about how the show had rekindled passions they had almost let go. Beginners described how Norm's patient instruction had given them the confidence to attempt their first real projects. Teachers wrote about students who had come to woodworking specifically because of what they had seen on Saturday morning television. Parents wrote about watching episodes with their children, and now adult children wrote about still remembering which projects they had watched with their parents. The depth and sincerity of these messages made something clear that television ratings had always suggested, but never fully captured. The New Yankee Workshop had genuinely shaped how millions of people thought about making things with their hands. What's remarkable is that the response contained no anger. There was grief, genuine sadness about losing something beloved. But it was a kind of grief that comes with respect and understanding. Most viewers seemed to comprehend, even without knowing the specific details of Norm's physical situation, that he had given what he could give. The show had received more from him than most television productions receive from anyone. Asking for more would have been unreasonable. Nearly a decade and a half later, in January 2023, all episodes of the New Yankee Workshop became available free on YouTube. A new generation of viewers discovered the show as if for the first time. Young people in their 20s and 30s, who had never seen it during its original run, found themselves captivated by Norm's quiet competence and the genuine craftsmanship on display. Comments filled with descriptions of people staying up until 2 in the morning watching episodes, ordering their first set of chisels, finding the content more calming than anything else available on the internet. The show, more than a decade off the air, was still doing what it had always done, making people want to go make something. After stepping back from the New Yankee Workshop, Norm continued with this old house in a more sustainable role as master carpenter, contributing expertise without carrying the entire weight of production. He finally had time for his own projects, his own home, his own work done at his own pace. He wrote, continuing the clear and practical teaching style that had defined his television work. In 2016, He appeared in a documentary called Felled about giving new life to fallen urban trees, a natural extension of how he had always viewed wood as something with history and meaning. In 2022, after more than 4 decades in television, Norm officially retired from this old house. The send-off matched everything about him, quiet and respectful, without spectacle. The workshop in Massachusetts still stands. Norm visits it sometimes, not to film, not to perform, but simply to build for himself. The real reason the new Yankee workshop ended ultimately is simple. Norm Abram gave that show everything he had for 21 years, and when his body made clear that everything had been given, he listened. He didn't try to keep going. He didn't compromise his standards by hiring others to do the work he had always done himself. He simply stepped away and continued being a craftsman on his own terms. In a world obsessed with attention and spectacle, Norm built a legacy by being genuinely good at what he did, quietly and consistently, with no drama whatsoever. And that, like, subscribe, and follow for more.